The winter of my senior year in high school, my friends and I wanted to cross something off our high school bucket list before we all went in different directions after graduation. There was a house in the next town that had a reputation for being haunted, and it was a rite of passage for seniors to spend a night at the house just after graduating. We lived just outside of Chassell, Michigan, close to Portage Lake, so winters are harsh and most rental houses are vacant in the coldest times of the year. But this house was always empty. More than likely, someone from away owned it and maybe died, leaving it abandoned, or someone's son or daughter still owned it, but never bothered to visit. Let's just say it was empty long enough that my grandparents, who lived in the town forever, remember it being empty. This particular house stood out from the local lake houses because it was a big Victorian house that never seemed to be occupied even when other houses came alive in the summertime with vacation goers and tourists. For years, seniors would visit the house and then go off to college or wherever, so we felt we had to go there too. We decided to go in the winter instead of after we graduated because my friend Laura was moving right after graduation, and Nicole was leaving to spend the summer with her dad. Neither one of them wanted to miss out on spending a night in a haunted house. I have to tell you that ever since I was little, I've been able to see things that other people couldn't. I've seen and heard things that can only be described as paranormal. The more history a place has, the more I can see and hear. It's been something I've lived with since I started being old enough to remember, but generally I can handle seeing what I see. Unless the death associated with the spirit was particularly horrifying. It's hard to have images like those intrude on your thoughts just out of the blue. My friends knew this about me, but like most people, they assumed I exaggerated with what I could see. We decided to meet after school on a Friday night, and I picked up my friends and we drove to the house. Chassell was a short drive through the woods. The house was set back in the trees, the driveway long and winding. We were laughing and talking excitedly, but honestly, I'm pretty sure my friends were as scared as I was. We got out and found an unlocked window. We carefully raised the big glass frame and climbed in. As we entered the house, we were immediately struck by how eerie everything looked. Nicole had a big flashlight and turned it on once she was inside. She panned it around the room, revealing the dust-covered furniture and the cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. The air was thick with the musty smell of neglect. We jumped when we heard scurrying just outside the flashlight's glow. Nicole panned over towards the direction of the sounds and saw a little mouse running along the edge of the floor. It disappeared out of sight. We laughed nervously, feeling silly for having jumped. The house was freezing, literally. Since it had been empty, it was no warmer than the outside temperature, and we could see our breath as we laughed. We looked through the first room. It was a living room of sorts. The wallpaper was peeling, and there was debris all over the floor. The boards creaked below our feet as we walked around. The floor was a mess, and I wondered if we might step right through the old wood in some places. We went from room to room, and every room looked about the same, dark, cold, and neglected. At the back of the house was the kitchen. There was an open door in the kitchen, and we could see stairs leading down to the darkness below. "I don't want to go down there," I said. "Oh, come on, we've gone this far, let's go," Laura said, leading the way. "Let me have the flashlight," she said to Nicole. Nicole handed her the flashlight and backed away. Laura started towards the doorway, and the door slammed shut as she reached it. We all jumped backwards. "Oh my God, what was that?" After a second, Laura said, "I'm sure it was just a draft. Come on, let's go." And she opened the door. She started down the stairs. Over her shoulder, I could see the basement was every bit as creepy as you can imagine. I was last to go towards the door, and I heard something behind me. It was a low whisper of a sound. Had I just heard someone whisper the word, "Go"? I turned and saw nothing. It was like my brain had manifested what I wanted to do. But we'd come this far. There wasn't much left to see of the old house. We'll just look down here, then leave, I told myself. It was so dark, and the low ceiling was covered in spiderwebs. We had to duck down to keep clear of them. As the last one on the stairs, I felt a cold rush of wind blast past me towards the basement. Nicole and Laura both looked back, and I stopped. Just behind them, I could see some light coalescing in a mist. There was something taking shape behind them. I pointed and stepped backwards, tripping and falling backwards onto the step behind me. My friends turned and looked at the basement and then back at me. They were calm and clearly couldn't see what I was seeing. But I was frozen in place, staring at what was forming in the basement. It was the vague shape of a boy. "Go!" it hissed at us. Without waiting, I got up and turned, climbing back up the stairs with Nicole and Laura following me. "What did you see?" they asked. "It was a ghost of a boy, and he told us to go." "Oh, that's sick," Laura said, clearly not taking that as a bad sign. "I really think we should go. Something's just not right here," I said. "There's just the upstairs, and then we'll go, okay?" Nicole said. Reluctantly, I agreed, and I wish I hadn't. At the foot of the stairs leading to the second floor, I saw a dark mist slither up the edge of the stairs. It dissipated on the stairs, and I bit my lip. In the past, this was one of the first things I'd see before an apparition appeared. That mist was very dark and thick, and it made me really nervous for what we might see upstairs. We heard a door close upstairs, and we all looked at each other with big eyes. The girls looked at me as though questioning if I'd seen anything, and I shrugged. "Something's here. I just don't know what yet." My voice shook. We climbed the stairs with a flashlight leading our way to the top. There was a hallway with a large mirror and then doors down either side. Every door was open except one, the farthest one. As we started down the hallway, Laura and Nicole looked at themselves in the mirror, and just as I was starting to look at myself too, a shadow person started forming at the end of the hallway and slipped through the closed door. I grabbed Nicole's arm. "There, in that room," I said, pointing to the room at the end of the hall. I was terrified, but at least I could see what was happening. I don't know if it would have been better to see what was happening like I could, or not see like Laura and Nicole. We reached the door, and Nicole opened it. She panned the flashlight around the room. It seemed empty, but was full of heavy energy. I started feeling nauseous and dizzy, but stepped ahead of Nicole and Laura. If something was about to manifest, I could at least see it coming, I thought to myself. We stepped into the room, and the dark mist started gathering again. It was taking shape, but this time it was changing, and changing fast. It went from one shape to another and didn't stop. It was just shifting, its shapes becoming more and more clear as it did. Faces were forming on the shapes, familiar ones that I'd seen before. The mist was twisting and contorting into the shapes of young people I had known. These were people that had graduated and moved on from our school. I watched in horror as the shifts slowed, and then I was staring at the faces of Laura and Nicole. They stared vacantly at me from the mist. I stumbled backwards where the girls had been, but they were gone. I was alone, facing this thing. In that moment, as the mist started shifting to reflect my face, something pulled me backwards and out into the hallway. The door slammed shut as I was thrust backwards. A glow was all around me, and I heard the word, "Go!" loudly and directly in my ear. I spun around and ran down the stairs and out the front door. I ran to the car, and my shaking hands could barely open the door and start the engine. I screeched out of that driveway and drove home. I told my parents what happened, and they called the police. They knew I didn't make things up about paranormal encounters. To their credit, they always believed me when I told them about the things that would appear to me. The old sheriff came to the house and asked me what happened. I told him exactly what happened, and he wrote it down until the part where I told him about the mist. He stopped writing and looked carefully at me. He looked at me as though I had told him my friends flew away on unicorns. I'm sure he thought I was making all this up. Then he stood up and said his goodbyes to my parents and left. I went over and over it in my mind. Something had helped me get away from that evil spirit that was collecting souls. Something had saved my life. What was heartbreaking to me was that I couldn't save any of them. That same night, regardless of what the sheriff had likely thought of my story, a search party formed to find the missing girls, but of course they wouldn't be found. Just like all the other kids that had supposedly gone off to college or work or moved, but were actually trapped in that house. I tell creepy stories about scary encounters and paranormal events. If this is your thing too, stay, listen, and subscribe to Lady Grimm for more stories. It's okay to keep the lights on. I had so many questions. Days went by and I was consumed with finding out more about the house, and more importantly, how I could get my friends back. Laura and Nicole's parents came to ask questions and find out where their daughters had run off to. They didn't believe my account and left flustered, angry, and crying. My parents were worried about me. They warned me to stay away from that house. They couldn't see things like I could, but they did believe my account. They were worried that whatever we had encountered could somehow hurt me. And until going into that house, I had dismissed their worries as just those of overprotective parents. But now I knew it could happen. I blamed myself in part. Why hadn't I insisted that we leave that night? Why had I given in to Laura and Nicole, knowing that things were escalating that night? I spent hours online researching the history of the property and the land around it. I couldn't find much, but disappearances of children started in the 1930s in this town. And the house had been owned by a Donald Vane starting in 1924. He had actually owned a great deal of land all around the lake, but aside from that, there wasn't much information about him online. I tried to find information on disappearances and the occult, but I kept running into dead ends. I wasn't sleeping well and was having nightmares about the house. I would dream of going up the stairs alone and going down that hallway. I would dream of seeing the faces in the mist take shape. I would dream of seeing my friends' faces empty and vacant. I dreamt of Laura and Nicole, and I imagined them being tortured somewhere just beyond where I could see, even with my abilities. But I never dreamed of the light entity that saved me. Never once. And this is how I knew something dark was reaching for me from that house through my dreams. Something was pulling me back towards the house to collect me too. I was terrified of going back there, but I knew I would eventually have to go. There was no chance that I was just going to let my friends be trapped there. If there was some hope, I could still save them. I needed to reach that light spirit that had helped me, and that meant going back to that house. I planned to go back and sit on the grounds. Maybe I could tap into something without going inside. I decided to go in the morning when it would be daylight and at least feel safer. I drove through the woods to the house. Everything about being there felt wrong. I got out of the car and with hands shaking, scanned all around me, but nothing looked different. I stood in front of that house for about 20 minutes until I could hear a humming sound. Now this was familiar. This was the sound a spirit made just before connecting. It's like they're trying to tune for a particular resonance. I closed my eyes to hear better. Daniel was the name I could feel, and there was that familiar glow. I opened my eyes and saw the shape of a boy. He was thin and tired-looking. I could feel his voice more than hear it. The voice was like a recollection, soft and muted. "Why are you here?" he asked. "I need to save my friends," I said. "How do I save them?" "I was the first," he said, and looked away, up towards the house. "I need you to tell me," I pleaded. Just then, a tall, thin man appeared at the upstairs window. He looked at me as Daniel disappeared. I saw a smile growing on his face. It was evil and dark, and as I stood frozen in terror, he became a mist and then disappeared. I jumped in my car and drove home. I was exhausted and laid down on my bed. Before I knew it, I was asleep. I dreamed of being followed home from that house, and of something watching me now from inside my house. I could see myself in my bed, with shadows all around me closing in tighter and tighter. I woke up drenched in sweat and feeling completely terrified. That dream was different, more vivid and detailed. I sat up and grabbed my laptop. I had found a witchcraft website that had instructions for crafting spells, and I needed a protection spell to keep myself safe from whatever this thing was. I decided on a smoke spell. I had some incense sticks and lit one, focusing on the energy to create my intention. As I crafted my intention and lit my incense, I felt a shiver run up my spine. Even with the spell in place, things felt off in my house, and I was feeling really uneasy. That night, I dreamed of Daniel. Not spirit Daniel, but Daniel as he used to be. He was young, maybe 10 years old, and was wearing a tan shirt and brown pants. His clothes were plain, and it took me a minute to see his clothes were from the 1930s or so. I could see Daniel in the field behind the house playing with a baseball. I see the baseball shatter one of the house's windows and Daniel running up to the house to retrieve it. A tall, thin man opens the front door, a look of pure hatred on his face. He grabs Daniel's arm and pulls him inside. I could see the inside of the house, full of a variety of exotic artifacts and heirlooms. There are animal head trophies on the walls. Everything seemed to be very carefully displayed. I hear a thud, and then see a lifeless Daniel being carried into the mirror at the top of the stairs. On the other side, the tall man is a black shadow, no longer a man. He places a Daniel-shaped doll on a shelf inside the mirror room. I woke in a pool of sweat, horrified at what I'd just dreamed. The dream was so real, I sat up in shock and felt for my phone to check the time. On the bed next to me was an old leather baseball. I jumped out of bed and scanned the room. I didn't own a baseball. Something had been here, in my room. Nothing else was out of place, but it still felt like something was watching me. I had shivers creeping up my spine again, and I didn't feel like I was alone. I went back to the witchcraft website for another protection spell. I found one that seemed fitting. I needed a mirror and a candle, and I had both. I grabbed a candle from the living room and reached for the mirror hanging over my desk. As I looked at the mirror, what I saw was the thin man staring at me. He was smiling a horrible smile, and I dropped the mirror, shattering it on the floor, and with it his image disappeared, and I could see only my reflection in the broken pieces. The room immediately felt lighter. I hoped that wasn't an omen, but an answer. I knew what I had to do. It was still dark when I left for the house. I arrived and stood staring at it, that horrible, looming house where evil things had happened. I just hoped that I wouldn't end up being another victim of this house and of the thin man. I opened the window and slipped into the living room. As I listened to the quiet, cold house, I began to feel a sense of dread. I remember thinking that I should have left a note for my parents in case I didn't make it back. At least they would know what happened to their kid, unlike the others that had just seemed to vanish. As I crossed the living room towards the stairs, there was a rush of darkness along the walls. It sounded like something was clawing at the wallpaper, tearing upwards from below. I rushed across the room and started up the stairs. As I climbed, the dark mist was forming all around me. I could feel its sickening cold damp clinging to my skin. At the top of the stairs, the mist started taking the shape of the thin man. I hurled my arm back to throw the old leather baseball into the big mirror at the top of the stairs, and as I did, the thin man's solid hand wrapped around my wrist tightly. "You cannot leave," his voice said. "You are now part of my collection, and you will never be able to escape." With a scream, I lobbed that ball as hard as I could, and as my arm arced overhead, the thin man's misty body whooshed into the mirror with the ball. As it shattered, I could see his reflection in each shard of the glass, raining down on the floor all around me. Behind the mirror was a long closet full of shelves. On each shelf, there were dolls of every size and shape. I was horrified and looked at all of their faces. These were all the children who had disappeared, forever locked in these doll shapes. I found the Daniel doll and the Laura and Nicole dolls. I sat in that closet and wept. They were gone. I couldn't bring them home after all. As I left that house, I took a lighter from my pocket and set the whole damn thing on fire. When the firefighters were finished putting out the flames and left, the small crowd that had formed lingered, gossiping about the fire and how the house that had been an eyesore for so many decades was finally gone. A thin man stepped into the debris and pulled out a large, cracked mirror buried in the wreckage. He walked through the small crowd, expressionless. "What do you want that for? It's a mess," one of the neighbors said. The thin man replied without looking back, "It's for my collection," and disappeared into the woods.